Okay, if you have looked at our schedule for the summer university, you have seen that there's a certain ordering. So we have the plenary lectures in the first 2 days, and we follow roughly the outset of any good economics textbook, like Man, Economy and State or Human Action. So we start with the fundamentals first, and then move our way up to ever more particular subjects. So we started off with the theory of value. And then we had a lecture on praxeology, so these basic things. And now we are moving to a more particular subject, which is human action, human interaction, especially within society. And the market is a particular case of human action, of human interaction within a social context. What we'll do in my lecture is, therefore, to talk about the division of labor. The theory of the division of labor is fundamental to understand the emergence of society, the material incentives that each individual has to join others in cooperative behavior. As we will see at the end of my lecture, there are such material incentives, whatever the circumstances are. That is, whether people are complementary to one another or whether they have the same strengths and so on. So I'll first talk about, give a few definitions, in particular definition of production, and then we'll proceed in 4 steps. I will first introduce to you the law of returns, and we'll talk about a more technical element that is a little bit less interesting or less important, but still useful, namely the production possibility frontier, the PPF, is a technical element. Then we'll talk about savings in the economy and how savings increase the productivity of human labor and therefore the consumption possibilities of individuals, so increase their living standards. And then in the last step, 4th step, we'll talk about the division of labor and how the division of labor achieves the same end. So my lecture covers something that is kind of fundamental, which you will find in all economics programs. All economics students learn this. Unfortunately, typically they do not learn this where they should learn it, namely either in the microeconomics class or in the macroeconomics class, which are the fundamental classes. But they learn it only typically in the class dealing with international economics, which is unfortunate because it is really a fundamental element that explains us why there is human cooperation at all. So for those of you who have not yet any training in economics, this might be entirely new. We'll keep it simple and focus on what is essential. And for those of you who had economics already, and you even had a class on international economics, it will not be entirely new, but I will stress certain features that are particular to, let's say, praxeology. I mean, the way you are reasoning, you try to ground everything you say in concrete, verifiable experience, and you derive it by a logical deduction. Okay, so first our definitions. Let's first notice that human action, that is, the choices that human beings make, always take place in a physical context. And there's always, I mean, we are here, this lecture hall, we have fortunately an air conditioning, I have a microphone, and all this has an impact on the learning experience, the productivity of our efforts here. So there's a physical context, and this physical context is not determined by the laws of praxeology, but by natural laws. Now, one element that we always deal with in economics, but which is in fact a natural law, is the law of returns, about which I will talk later. Man, in this physical context, then acts, that is, he pursues a certain objective by transforming his environment. I'm producing myself now, although that's not the colloquial sense in which you use the word production in the English language, but from an economic point of view, it's precisely that. It is a conscious transformation of nature. I'm transforming part of my natural environment, that is you, in this case, by communicating information to you, which in certain cases is new, in the hope that this will make you different human beings from what you would have been in the absence of my lecture. Okay, we have a transformation of, conscious transformation of nature. Same thing if you are in agricultural production and you plough the soil and so on, you transform the soil. It's different from what it would have been in the absence of your action. And so on and so on. You're a shoe producer, a car producer, you produce lamps or watches and so on. You always bring about a different state of nature than it would have been in the absence of your action. And that is production. So we can define production as a conscious transformation of nature in view of a new state of affairs that has, from the point of view of the acting person, a higher subjective value than the state of nature that would have obtained otherwise. I prefer that you be informed about those things that I tell you, rather than being ignorant about them. That's, among other things, why I'm standing here. And of course, they pay me a couple of $1 million. That helps also. So the agricultural producer is transforming, is ploughing the soil and so on, plowing the soil, because he prefers that it be amenable to planting seeds and so on, rather than not being amenable, etc., etc. Now, any productive effort then is determined by a law of nature that we call the law of returns. And we can represent this by a graph. Austrians don't use many graphs. You won't find many graphs in Man Economy and State. That is, Man Economy and State is actually quite full of graphs, but not in human action. And the reason is that praxeological laws are not quantitative laws. Or more precisely, they are about quantities, but they are not quantitative relationships. So we can do without graphs and we can do without maths. But as far as natural laws is concerned, we can express most of them with graphs and similar devices. So we have here a quantitative relationship between a dependent and an independent variable. We have the independent variable, we have an x, and we have here a variable that we call q. X is the quantity of a factor of production that we use. And Q is the quantity of the product that results from this productive effort. It must be understood that Q at all times is a function, mathematically speaking, of X and other factors of production. Let's take here maybe just 3 factors of production, so we have X, Y, and Z. In any human action we are using several factors of production, one of which is always labor. Right? Production is defined by human interaction, so human labor is always one of the factors of production. But because we have a physical environment, there are other factors that also come into play. The microphone is one other factor of production. There's the air conditioning, there's seating, and so on. So we have different factors of production that come in our case into play. The agricultural producer, he will have a plow that can be of good metal or of bad. So he has this factor of production. The quality of the soil, is it easy to plow or not? It's another factor of production. So we have always several factors of production here, X, Y, Z. And what the law of returns tells us is that given a certain variation of one of the factors and given unchanged quantities for the other, so therefore we put this dash above the others, so we hold them constant, we vary just one factor of production, we get something like this. Okay. Now, it's not in all cases so that we have maybe a nice continuous curve. It's not in all cases so that the curve steadily increases here and then ultimately declines. But what we typically have, and that's the crucial point, is, and not only typically, what we necessarily have, is some maximum somewhere. And at some point, there's a maximum of product that is generated by the use of this factor X, however big the use of the factor X is. Okay, that's what the law says. This is always so. And I will explain to you in a minute why this must be so. We can first approach this question by considering what would happen if the law of returns did not hold. What would be the implications? Well, the implication would be that by varying this factor X, we could create just any amount of Q. Okay, so whatever these other factors of production Y and Z are, we could produce any amount of our product. So it would imply, for example, that we could plant all the wheat in the world on 1 square meter, or square yard for you Americans. Okay? Because we could just vary our factor, for example, labor. We work this square yard of land over and over again, and we can produce millions and billions of bushels of wheat. Okay, that would be the implication. Clearly, that's not the case. Right? So empirically, we know that cannot be true. It certainly doesn't hold true for wheat production, but I tell you, it doesn't hold true for any type of production. And the reason why the impact of any factor X is limited is that the productive services rendered by the other factors of production, Y and Z, is limited. Okay? So the limitation that comes here into play, that the bottleneck for the impact of the factor X, results from the fact that the other factors have not been increased and their services are limited. A piece of land can render only limited amount of services, growing wheat and so on. So however much work you put into it, you cannot get beyond a certain point. Right? So we have here the law of returns, which says there's a maximum impact for any factor of production on the product, and the cause of this fact, of this limitation, of this bottleneck, is that the productive services of the other factors of production that are needed are necessarily limited all the time. Now this is so clearly whatever production process we consider. We were in agricultural production, so we might consider with different factors of production like land, we have seed, labor, fertilizer. So if we keep land, seed, and fertilizer constant, we increase labor. It doesn't increase the product indefinitely, and so it goes for the other factors of production as well. It's not by fertilizing our square yard of land indefinitely, and we sink it, we drown it with fertilizer, that we will therefore create more wheat. Actually, what can happen then is that the product diminishes. And you have 15 people working on a square yard of land. Well, it's more likely that they will trample on the poor seed and then prevent that anything grows, rather than another thing, or fertilizer is the same thing, you diminish the product. One other example from daily life, operation of a coffee shop. In a coffee shop you have different factors of production. You have waiters, you have tables, you have square surface, and you have coffee machines. Right? And so for any of those factors of production we have the same relationship. It's limited for the impact of coffee machines. It's not because you buy 1,000 coffee machines that you increase proportionally the amount of coffee sold, because you are limited by the other factors of production. Your surface is limited. You have maybe 1,000 square feet coffee shop, so there is only so and so many cups of coffees that you can serve. Okay. However many machines you have, even if you increase the surface, if you're still limited by the other factors of production, you will only again serve a certain amount of factors of production of cups of coffee, which is the product. Okay, so we have the law of returns and the explanation of the law of returns, and we can from here move on to introduce an interesting element, which is the production possibility frontier, typically represented by another graph that is very widespreadly used in economics, because it's useful because it illustrates, it does not demonstrate, but it illustrates the trade-offs that we have to face in every choice. So how do we get from here to there? We have here illustration of the law of returns, and the factor X that we are most interested in is human labor. Okay, because human labor by definition is used in all production processes. So we have therefore the possibility to create different diagrams, each time with X. Let's say we have here two different production processes that economists like: production of guns and production of butter. It's not really that French economists like the production of guns. Prefer butter. Well, that's a different subject, right? Even whether you like it or not, it always looks somewhat like this. Okay, always the same thing. Now we have so X is used in both processes. That is, whatever amount of labor we invest in the production of butter is no longer available for the production of guns, and the other way around. Oh yes, you're right. Yeah, can I see my nice handwriting? Guns and butter. Okay, so now we can plug both of them into an overall diagram that looks like this. So we can, this we'll transfer here. We have here x in hours. And here we have therefore guns. And what we need to do now is to turn this around, right? The curve must look like this. And we've turned it 180 degrees. And we plug this diagram, plug it here. Okay? So we have here again labor, and here then butter production. Oh, excuse me, no. Yeah, this is also X invested. We put it here. It's here, and we have here butter. And so we have a curve that looks like this. Okay? Forget about this. So this is X invested in butter. This is X invested in gun production. So now we have a budget constraint. That is, the amount of labor that we can possibly invest in any investment project is limited. Right? The day has only 24 hours. Right? Germans work most of this. Frenchmen a little less. Italians hardly anything at all. But however much you work, it's always limited, right? It's physically absolutely limited, so we can plug this in wherever, and everybody can influence. Yeah, let's say, so this is a Japanese workday. We have 16 hours, okay? Typical Japanese workday. And so these 16 hours can then be invested either in gun production or in butter production. Let's say if we invest everything in the production of guns, so a Japanese living in the United States, so he produces this amount of guns, okay, and at the same time he produces zero butter, so he is exactly on this point, he produces this quantity of guns and zero amount of butter. If he spends all his time producing butter, okay, sounds like an Irish producer, Japanese person living in Ireland. So you get this here, this much of butter and zero guns. Now then, of course, you have various intermediate combinations. For example, you can have, let's say here, 12 hours invested in gun production, then you get this quantity of guns, and on the other hand, you get this quantity here of butter. So we have here in this upper quadrant, we have a combination that lies here. Okay? See the principle? And now we can do this for all points, for all combinations, for any combination of butter and gun production. Let me take maybe just one other combination, this here. We get this amount of guns and this amount of butter. Okay, you see, if we connect all points, they will give us something of a curve of this sort. Okay, and that's the PPF, the production possibility frontier. It's a frontier because it gives us the physical limits of possible production quantities. Right? And the interest is, I have told you when I started talking about this, the interest of the PPF is that it illustrates the trade-off that we have in making choices, that is the trade-offs that we have in life. Right? So we can generalize here, we have a good 1 and a good 2, x1 and x2. And we always have something like this. We always have a PPF between any two economic goods, any two goods that are rare. We have this relationship. X1 could be making your wife happy, X1 earning a lot of, well, no, wait a minute, going fishing. Would not be a trade-off, right? Guns and butter could be present production, future production, right? The more you produce for present consumption, the less amount of resources you have available for future production, and so on, right? It covers a lot, covers everything. Now the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how can we, and that's the crucial practical question, one of the crucial practical questions that has to be addressed by economics, and that has been addressed by economists of the past, starting with Adam Smith, whom I mentioned yesterday. The question is, How can we unloosen these limitations that we see here, right? So the point is we can choose any combination of the factors x1 and 2 that are on the frontier or within the frontier. Any of those points can be chosen, right? But I cannot go beyond this. So the question is it maybe possible that I extend this frontier, right? That I go out somewhere here? That's the big question, right? Or, put it in other words, if we stay with our law of returns, we have here x and q, and I have this curve, can I move the curve upward? And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what we can do, fortunately, and that's the reason why we are no longer living a hand-to-mouth existence as the first human beings in the primitive stage. Right? It's precisely because this is possible that we are living in relative affluence today, and why it will be possible if more people learn about Austrian economics that our descendants might live in even more affluent state. So what are the mechanisms that bring this about? Here we have two mechanisms in particular. One is savings and capital accumulation. The other one is the division of labor. There's a third major mechanism that we might also mention, but into which I will not analyze in any detail, is innovation, right? Technological innovation in particular, but also innovation relating to organization. I will mention later on that innovation is always limited by capital accumulation, which is not actually, well, which I can say right now. I mean, the point is that it doesn't help you if you have lots of technological knowledge, but you have not the means to apply it, right? People in Africa have access to all of Western technology. It's not this knowledge lacking knowledge that limits them. What limits them is they don't have the means to put this in practice. Okay, and these means must come from capital accumulation. So we need to focus on capital accumulation, which is the basic mechanism. We'll look at this now. So how do we get up from here to here? Well, we need to consider that, again, I'm writing down the mathematical relationship that exists here. And so we have said that y and z are limited. What we need to do now is to increase the quantities of y and of z. If we do this, then our curve will move up here. Okay. So this curve represents y2 larger than y1. For example, if we just increase the factor y. This is y1. Okay. Still with our example of the coffee shop. So we have coffee machines of a certain surface. We have a certain amount of tables, a certain amount of waiters. Now we hire more waiters, and at the same time we buy a larger shop. So we have a more surface. The waiters don't stand in one another's way. So as a consequence, the curve as a whole moves up. The amount of product created by per hour of work, that is per hour worked by a waiter, increases. And we get a shift upward. And then, of course, we can do this in principle indefinitely, right? We can do this. It goes on and on and on. And the process of civilization is to a large extent due to this, that we're constantly increasing these other complementary factors of production, and thereby increasing the productivity, shifting the level of productivity of our factor X, that is, of labor. Now, what does this imply as far as the organization of production is concerned? Well, it implies that we need to, let me maybe do this on the same diagram, that we need to rearrange our, the way we go about production. Let's say we have here a basic scheme of a production process. We have here an arrow that represents the passage of time. And we have 2 points of time that we need to distinguish. There's a first point of time and then a later point of time. It's a very primitive diagram. I love primitive diagrams because they allow us to illustrate everything that is essential. So here we start producing, and here we get the product, right? Here we mobilize the factors of production, and we put them to work, and they are being combined and put to work through human labor, the essential ingredient of all production processes. And then at a later point of time, T1, we get our product. Okay. So, let's transfer this here. So we have here again this production process, now this time passage, right? So we have here T1 and here we have T0. This was the production process that corresponded to this first curve. Right? We were using human labor, and human labor was maybe combined with factors that existed spontaneously in nature, right? Like apple plugging or other things. Planting seed on a soil that we hadn't transformed before with tools and so on. Now, if we increase the amount of Y that we use, then we need to produce Y first. Okay, we first need to have a greater quantity of Y, then we can put it to use in this production process here. So we need to extend our production backward. We need to add another step, another stage of production. Right? That starts now at T minus 1, and in which we produce Y, and in the second stage of production we produce Z. Oh, excuse me. Q. Here we have our Q. Okay? So this is a representation of the time structure of production. And we have here also another element, the different stages, right? We have a stage that is called a first stage of production. This is a higher order stage, a second stage of production. There was a question over there? Yeah. Okay. So we add this second step to the first. And then, of course, what we can do then is to raise the question, well, how can we increase the productivity of producing Y? Okay, Y is also being produced by human labor and by some other input. So we can create a tool that will allow us to produce Y more efficiently. Right? So we add another stage of production. And this is extension of the length of overall production is called roundabout production, or making production more roundabout. It's a technical term. Okay. So production is always roundabout to the extent that it's always extended in time. But what we do through the accumulation of capital is to increase its roundaboutness. Right? And as it becomes more roundabout, the physical product or the physical productivity increases. Okay. That's the whole point why we do this. For the same amount of labor, this amount of labor here, let's say x1, we get at first, in the primitive stage, we get this amount of product, let's say here, and then as we accumulate capital, and as we lengthen the process of production, we increase our quantities of product. Have more things that we have produced, therefore more things that we can consume. Right? It's as simple as that. The lengthier production process is, the more productive it is. Okay. Now, since this can go on indefinitely, right? We can go this way. In principle, from a technological point of view, we can go on indefinitely as long as we have ideas enough how to lengthen the structure of production. What are the limitations of this? Why don't we do this indefinitely? And there are two reasons for this. The first factor that limits the length of the production process is the subjective value of the product. Right? You don't go on producing wheat because, of course, wheat has many useful employments, right? You can make cakes and pasta out of this, and you can actually also make good schnapps, right? And you can give it away and feed the pigs and eat ham every Sunday or whatever, every day in the week. So, but at some point, the uses that we have of this good is limited. So we don't want any more of this, and at this point of time, we stop producing it. We don't lengthen our structure of production any further. The second factor limiting the length of the production structure is capital. And by capital, I mean now the availability of consumer goods, which is also called the real fund of sustenance, that is needed to support the persons involved in this production process through time. let's consider that maybe this stage of production, the last one, is takes just a week or something. Okay, so in order to survive this production process, our person, or the laborer here involved, he needs to be able to survive 1 week in order to see his efforts come to fruition. Okay, how can he survive this? Only by having at his disposition some consumer goods that will allow him to survive during the week, and these consumer goods must necessarily have come out of past efforts, either by himself or by other people who have given them to them. So the capital that we use to sustain our productive efforts always result from past savings, and they always result from past activities, and are so to say invested in sustaining us during the labor time required to bring this process to fruition. Now, if we extend now the structure of production, if we lengthen it, then the amount of sustenance required increases, of course, right? If you do this a couple of stages, then you come very quickly to a couple of months or a year. And there, as we know, of course, there are investment projects that take not only a couple of weeks or months, they take years. So in order to survive this, we need to have enough sustenance, enough consumer goods resulting from past production that can sustain all people involved in this production throughout the entire process. And that's the role of savings. So it's savings that limit at any point of time the overall maximum length that human production efforts, production projects can have, and therefore limit the physical productivity of human labor. So it's not technology, or not technology alone at any rate, that is the main limiting factor, it's savings. So this, what I've presented to you, is the analysis that has been essentially developed by Eugen von Boehm-bawerk. It was going beyond this, in this respect, beyond Adam Smith, as I've mentioned yesterday. I'm not available. Okay. Now, let's maybe illustrate this with a few diagrams, what the implications would be for economic growth. Well, I'm now illustrating this not with the law of returns diagram, but with a PPF. So you see, before we had our goods X1, X2, now we have present consumption and future consumption. The way to move the PPF outward, which is what we were interested in, is to reduce present consumption, right? So we choose a different, before we were living here, right? We were happy savages, and it was perfect with our life, and so we're living hand to mouth, and maybe we survived. Now what we're doing now is to make some savings, right? We're not eating all the fish, for example, that we have fished, right? Let's say we've at a life in which we could fish with our bare hands 2 fish per day, right? And we needed 1 fish to survive, and so we had 2 fish on one day, and then at the rest of leisure time, okay? Working one day, sleeping the next, or looking at the birds the next, singing love songs for your wife or companion, probably in those primitive days. Now what you're doing now, if you start saving, is that you don't consume as much. That is, for example, you renounce to your leisure day. The second day you can still eat the second fish, but you no longer look at the sky, but you start working on a factor of production that will increase your fishing. For example, you start building a fishing rod. Okay? And the fishing rod will therefore allow you, so you choose this combination, the fishing rod now makes you more productive. You fish more fish, 5 fish per day, for example. Okay? So you're on this new PPF. Right? And then again, you can increase your productivity by using the 4 days that you have now available to produce a net. You can even further move out the production possibility to frontier. Okay? So we have here the basic mechanism of a growing economy. We need to reduce consumption first, and this implies an increased savings. Use the savings in productive efforts, and thereby increase the overall physical productivity of our economy. And we can go on doing this. So this is a growing economy. And then for the same reason, of course, we can also have a shrinking economy. Right? You overdo it with your consumption, Start eating enjoying too much leisure, for example, or having some nice wars or other fight-outs. And then, of course, you can no longer sustain production processes that are as long as those that you had in the past, so your overall productivity shrinks, right? So the same process can move backwards. So we have a process of civilization and decivilization that can be illustrated with this diagram, in which springs from saving, a process of saving and desaving. So we have here one important mechanism, and in fact the most important mechanism of economic growth, very briefly illustrated. And what you will do in the next days, you will see how the same process works out in the market economies. Professor Garrison and Professor Murphy, I believe, will explain how the same process presents itself in a modern monetary economy. And the main difference is, as compared to the facts that we consider here. Here we are looking at those processes only from a physical point of view. Right? We are just considering the relationship that exists between the time of production and the overall quantities that are being produced. What they will do is to bring this in relationship with market prices. How market prices translate the value judgments of consumers and make lengthier investment projects more worthwhile than shorter, or the other way around. Right? So, but it's just, on the physical level, it always stays. We always have this basic mechanism. It's just a little more complicated. Right. Okay, so I have my things here, right? So this would be called a stationary economy, right? We always have the same PPF. It doesn't move because the amount of savings that we have are just sufficient to reproduce the capital goods that the tools that we already use. We have a growing economy if we save more and therefore shift outward our PPF, and we have a shrinking economy in the case when we consume too much and then move back inward. Okay, let's turn now to the second basic mechanism of economic growth, which is the division of labor. So people can profit, they can create a physical surplus by cooperating with one another. Here we can distinguish between three cases. In the first case, there are what economists call absolute advantages for each of the producers. You have one person who is a better producer of good 1, and the second person is a better producer of good 2. And they both need goods 1 and 2. The second case, they are exactly equal, and in the third case, we have the case of superiority of one producer as compared to the other. That is, one producer is the Superman, the other is the zero. It's not as good, right? The German and the and the Bavarian. Okay, so let's start with case 1. We have two persons, Peter and Paul, and Peter produces 5 rabbits. So this is a very primitive economy, right? We're not yet talking about all the nice things that we can produce in a monetary economy, right? Complex goods and iPhones and so on. No, here we are on a very essential level, which I also choose then to illustrate that the laws that we now talk about really apply in all conditions in which we have just 2 individuals, whatever their equipment is. So Peter can hunt rabbits, so he can kill 5 rabbits in 5 hours. Okay, and he can also plug 1,000 berries in 5 hours. Paul, he can hunt 10 rabbits in 5 hours, and he will plug 800 berries per 5 hours. So we hear what is the total product that we get. So they're not yet coordinated. They're not yet cooperating. Each of them is just producing the same 2 goods, but in separation from the other person. No coordination between the 2. So Peter is producing 5 rabbits, Paul 10, so we have 15 rabbits, and we get 1,800 berries. Okay, so this is, if you wish, the aggregate product, the national product in real terms, real GDP of this economy. Now we look at what happens after the division of labor, because we see, of course, immediately that they do have an incentive to cooperate they can both benefit from coordinating themselves, that is, dividing labor in such a way amongst themselves that Peter, who is the better berry plucker, will specialize entirely in berry plucking, whereas Paul, who is the better hunter, will specialize entirely in hunting. So what Peter will do is then to produce 2,000 berries in 10 hours, and Paul, and Paul will produce 20 rabbits in 10 hours. So the same amount of hours worked, right? Both of them have worked 10 hours, so total of labor input, aggregate labor input is 20 hours, and we get now 20 rabbits and 2,000 berries. This is the physical product of our economy has increased. There's a physical surplus that comes into play only due to the cooperation between the two. Right? With a causal mechanism, cooperation is the cause of additional product that would not have come into existence without the cooperation. And so we see here, therefore, they both have a material incentive to join hands, to cooperate, and therefore we see here that the division of labor is a civilizing factor. Peter and Paul, they might hang out together if they like one another, but let's say they hate each other's nose, right? Because these incentives exist, they have a material incentive just to shut up or not always slap the other guy on the head, but to cooperate with him because their own well-being depends on them. It's a very powerful force of civilization. Ludwig von Mises called this the law of association. The law of association says that there are material incentives for human beings to cooperate with one another. Therefore, they form human societies. Now, in the case 2, I won't do this numerically. In case 2, both persons would be exactly equal. So Peter would have the same productivities as Paul. For example, Paul would also chase 5 rabbits in 5 hours and pluck 1,000 berries in 5 hours. In this case, there are no incentives to cooperate. You cannot increase a physical surplus by joining hands. Now, this, of course, has very inconvenient implications for our friends, the egalitarians, right? Because they think that the more equal human beings become, the better for everybody. But what economic analysis shows is exactly the inverse. People profit from the fact that they are unequal, not from the fact that they are turned into clones. Right? It's very important that we have these inequalities, and so we have a human society is a society of people that are unequal in many, many different ways, and what they do is to exploit precisely these inequalities to their mutual benefit. Now let's consider the hardest case, the case of the Superman, okay? The German and the Bavarian or whatever. I always tell my students in France, because the French media have this obsession with China, right? It's the Chinese case, right? So we see here that Peter is a superior producer in all respects. He chases more rabbits and plucks more berries than Paul in the same time frame. Okay? Peter is the Superman. Paul is the Nullard. Peter is China. Paul is France. Right. So then, we can understand that Paul might sit at the feet of Peter and beg him to share some of the fruits of his labor. But what interest could Peter have in cooperating with Paul? I mean, clearly he can just smash him and, it's just maybe pity, right? So in former times, before economics came into full swing in the 18th and 19th century, these considerations were used as a justification of political power. Right? You get the great Norman invaders in all countries, or the German invaders, right? Now, what interest could they have to cooperate with all these underlings running around, right? So, okay, well, they share protection services and so on, but then at least the others owe obedience, okay? So you shut up. Now, what economic analysis shows is that even in such a case, both parties can profit materially from cooperating, from dividing labor amongst them. And the only condition for this to obtain is that the inequality be relative. So we have absolute advantages here for Peter on all levels, but he is relatively superior in chasing rabbits. We see that he is 5 times better than Paul in chasing rabbits, whereas he is only 2 times as efficient as Peter in plucking berries. Okay? So otherwise said, Paul, though he is absolutely inferior in berry plucking, has a relative advantage in berry plucking. And this relative advantage, or comparative advantage, can be exploited to create a division of labor. And in this division of labor, Paul has to concentrate entirely on where he is entirely relatively best, namely plucking berries. And Peter has to rearrange his production schedule in such a way that he creates a greater amount of rabbits, but also still produces some berries. So let's see how this works. So here Paul produces only berries. He plucks now 1,000 berries in 10 hours. And Peter rearranges his production schedule. He produces only berries during 3 hours, so plucks 600 berries, and has 2 hours more to chase rabbits, so he chases 7 rabbits. Overall production, real GDP, 7 rabbits and 1,600 berries. So we have again a physical surplus that is exclusively due to cooperation. And what it shows is that both the Superman and the underling have an incentive, a material incentive to cooperate. It's not only Paul who depends on Peter, it is equally Peter who depends on Paul for his well-being. So whatever the circumstances are, human beings do have a material incentive to cooperate. And it is these material incentives that are maybe not the only force, but a very important driving force for the formation of society. So I sum up, because we need to get to the photo, was what I've been told. So we talked about the binary. I gave you an introduction to the theory of production. We have talked about the basic laws of production as they hold in all settings of human cooperation. That is, not only in the market economy, but in all forms of human cooperation, in particular in a barter economy. We've defined production as the conscious transformation of nature in order to create a new state of affairs that has a higher subjective value for the producer than the state of affairs that it would otherwise have obtained. We have seen that there is a law of returns, which is a law of nature, and basically says that the productive impact of any single factor of production has an absolute limitation. There is a bottleneck. We have seen that this bottleneck can be loosened, can be not entirely abolished, but loosened by increasing the other factors of production that are also used in this production process, which implies that the production process has to be extended, has to be lengthened in time. This lengthening in time is mainly limited by the availability of means of sustenance, that is, real capital, real consumer goods, that must stem out of past revenue. So it's savings that determine the overall length of production and therefore the overall physical productivity of human labor. And the same benefit can obtain through the division of labor. And a similar benefit can obtain through this. Human coordination creates a physical surplus. So human beings have an incentive to form societies, to associate with one another. That's what Mises called the law of association. But if we look at these different mechanisms, it's again that savings are the main and the essential factor. Because savings, by increasing the length or allowing for a lengthening of the structure of production, creates new industries and therefore new venues of specialization. Let us briefly consider this again. Where did I have my diagram? Yeah. Okay. Right, so we have here this process of more roundabout production. If we have a very primitive economy, then we have possibilities for specialization only to the extent that we have different consumer goods industries. What savings does is to create new industries, because all these stages of production do not necessarily have to be performed by the same institution or the same person who performs the last step here. Right, so new industries emerge, new opportunities for specialization, and therefore for the division of labor emerge. So savings is by far the most fundamental, the most powerful mechanism, because it determines the division of labor in its turn. So far for the subject. Now, I thank you for your attention, and we turn to the photo. Good photo.
Thank you very much. much, Guido, for the few minutes there.